Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes.
Alexander, tell us, if we talk about the losses of the Russian Federation, do they really feel more acute now than before? Yes? As we look at how Putin is now trying to replenish, so to speak, the need for manpower.
Well, the thing is, it's necessary to understand that the Russian army is engaged in offensive actions. That is, they are conducting an offensive. And it's clear that the offensive is mainly using small infantry groups. Consequently, the losses are increasing because disregarding these losses, disregarding the lives of the personnel, they are being thrown. It can be said that the tactics of using small tactical groups are changing. They can vary. That is, if previously they consisted of about 10 people, up to 10 people, roughly one squad. 10 people, up to 10 people, roughly one squad. Now it can be 2, 3, or 4 people, well, who are directly participating in these numerical infantry assaults. Well, as the Russian war correspondents themselves sometimes write, the Ukrainian army sets up such a highly effective drone barrier that it prevents the defense from being breached. Plus, artillery is in operation, along with other types of weaponry. Therefore, based on this, then the losses are increasing. And we see that they are reaching new scales every month. I can tell you that losses are increasing, including those of artillery systems that Russia is unfreezing and taking out of storage, including those that were produced almost immediately after the end of World War II. These are also increasing. If we soon see the statistics and summarize the results, it will be evident that in April there could be another record level of losses. In other words, another record of Russian artillery losses will be broken, precisely because our drones are being used effectively along with counter-battery warfare and so on. This was mentioned and particularly emphasized by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Alexander Syrskyi, who pays special attention to the development of drones, their use on the front line, the technologies and so forth, the monthly meetings, which involve the commanders of units, the best units of the armed forces that use drones as effectively and reliably as possible, clearly show that the figures for destroyed or damaged, disabled Russian equipment, artillery systems, and personnel losses are only increasing. And therefore, of course, these losses need to be replenished. How does Russia do this? In various ways. One of them is the classic method, that is mobilization, which, for obvious reasons, is not called that in Russia, since Putin wants to create a nice picture and put on a brave face in a bad situation, making it seem like everything is fine, and to create the impression and illusion that losses are being replenished exclusively by volunteers, the so-called contract soldiers, that is, those who have signed up for contract service. But in reality, most of these people are mobilized individuals who received draft notices, then reported to the military enlistment office, and were faced with the fact, sometimes even through methods of pressure, intimidation, and so on, that they should sign the contract, and that's it. Well, that's the first point. The second point in how does this happen? This is done by offering money payments and trying in this way. That is, this is also talked about less. But now they have started, especially at the beginning of this year, to speak out more. Previously, they didn't want to, kept it secret, but now there's a whole campaign about how much each region will pay, which autonomous republic will pay how much. That is, if earlier the Russian command tried to keep this, let's say, under wraps and not show it, so now they are showing it. There is no other choice. And why didn't they want to show it? Well, because they didn't want to create the impression that this war, let's say, is not patriotic, not driven by such a surge. But it turns out that for many Boti PD, money matters more than the infusion of Russian propaganda, Putin's decisions, and so on. No, it doesn't work. Even in Russia, where the state propaganda machine, where there is no freedom of speech, where there is censorship, and all this has been working for years, but even they couldn't ensure this patriotic surge of volunteers for themselves and resort to money. And the next category is military personnel who come from other countries. And there are two subcategories here. The first subcategory is regular troops. These are North Korean, who do not hide that they are present and performing tasks in the Kursk region. And we cannot rule out that North Korean troops will appear in the occupied part of Ukraine as well, with the aim of carrying out Russian combat tasks and so on. This is the first subcategory. And the second subcategory is mercenaries from third countries. Various countries, absolutely different. In South America, in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa. Well, let's say there are also representatives from other countries. These are essentially those they are trying to use to replenish and compensate for these losses. And it's clear that the intensity of the hostilities is such that quite often the level of professional and specialized training and sometimes even the theoretical knowledge of those servicemen who are sent into the meat grinder assaults suffers. Well, and they try to move them as quickly as possible, especially those who are recruited with money. Well, they try to transfer these volunteers as quickly as possible directly closer to the line of combat engagement for their own interests. But I can tell you that if we now pay attention to the intensity of the hostilities, despite the fact that Russia is indeed continuing to conduct military operations, despite the fact that we see, despite some statements from Putin and the Kremlin that he is ready to introduce a ceasefire from May 8th and so on, there is no basis to say that there is any preparation for such actions. Russia is deploying new forces, but it becomes notable that, let's say, more and more problems within the Russian army are coming to light. And, well, let's say Russia is trying to solve all this through motorized infantry assaults, motorcycle assaults, assaults by small infantry groups, and so on. They are being destroyed in large numbers. But now, if we focus specifically on this moment, we can say that reaching the administrative borders of the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions is already being considered by Russia and the Russian command, not just as a tactical success and task completion, but also as a kind of operational success. Achieving even an operational level where they can say, these are the goals we are accomplishing. Although earlier, I want to remind you that the goals were completely different. And the goals were about the occupation of Ukraine, establishing a pro-Russian regime of power here, and so on. Now they are indeed reducing their goals. And here I basically agree with the conclusions of the authors of the publication in American CNN, who, citing their sources in the intelligence community and political circles in the USA, may say that, Putin is changing his goals. That is, from Kyiv in 3 days on Natintin. The current goals are now to try to make a breakthrough by May 9th at the cost of enormous losses, just to somehow mark an unclear achievement of reaching the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region. And another noteworthy fact is that we are witnessing yet another episode indicating that the Kyiv in 3 days plan is not working and everything changes instantly. This is evident in the fact that Putin is practically begging Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire on May 9th, as this essentially admits his insecurity and inability to guarantee the safety of the delegations that might attend the parade, and even to ensure the parade takes place at all, even despite all the air defense systems that are in service and cover Moscow in large numbers, because Moscow is important, while other Russian regions remain without air defense coverage, which is something that local residents and Russian war correspondents in particular complain about, criticizing such decisions by the Russian command, pointing out serious problems precisely in the fact that other areas are not covered. Well, that's essentially what's happening now, and let's say what's currently affecting the replenishment of manpower. But I can tell you that the calculations being published, well, a few months ago, there was a report from the British Army, and specifically the British Military Command, including the General Staff of the British Forces Ministry, and they concluded that well, for Russia to advance, for example, on Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, they took two regional centers where at least 2 million manpower is necessary. And, well, if these 2 million are well equipped and armed with modern weaponry, it would take about 4 years of offensive operations at the very least. That's it. Forbes calculated that at this pace, it would take about 200 years to fully occupy Ukraine. But everything depends on the pace of advancement. Today, everything is being done to reduce the pace of Russian troop advancement and to inflict as many losses as possible, preventing the enemy from quickly forming reserves to continue offensive actions. And as the US President Trump's special representative for Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, quite rightly emphasized this week, he gave an interview to Fox News, and he very correctly pointed out that the successes of Russian troops in Ukraine are measured in meters, not miles. And Russia is not winning this war.
Alexander, I would like you to comment further, much on the latest successful attack by the armed forces of Ukraine. Yes, the air forces of the Ukrainian armed forces delivered a devastating strike on the command post of Russia's 6th Motorized Rifle Division in the Bakhmut area. This was reported by the Ukrainian General Staff. As a result of the fire damage, the Russian army's ability to manage operations near Pokrovsk has been significantly reduced. The data on enemy losses is being clarified. Alexander, what is your assessment of what is currently happening around this particular settlement? Because we understand that the army of Russian occupiers does not cease its attempts to assault these positions of the armed forces of Ukraine.
Well, look, because why do they not stop assaulting? Because this offensive is not of a military nature, but rather military-political, even political and military propagandistic, I would say. That is, well, we must clearly understand this, that Russia has repeatedly attempted to attack Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk direction. These were attempts made last year, and even last year. In September, many Western OSINT analysts, media representatives, and even here, in principle, talked about the possibility that hostilities could take place directly in Pokrovsk, and they gave various forecasts that in the coming weeks or days, battles could already be happening directly in Pokrovsk in the settlement. This did not happen. And then Russia tried to encircle Pokrovsk. It didn't work out. The armed forces of Ukraine provided effective defense. Then they tried to half encircle it. That didn't work either. Now moreover, they have lost a huge number of people, equipment, artillery, but they continue to assault. The goal now is to reach the administrative borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Why do I say that the goal is more propagandistic? Because, let's say, as of today, it's not feasible to say that the enemy will have enough forces and means after these battles to actively conduct combat operations in the territory of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Actively means with advances, with the ability to move forward there. This is not something that can be discussed. But of course, to complete the task and check the box, to say that they reached the administrative borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region, yes, they are trying to achieve this. And therefore, quite serious enemy forces are indeed concentrated there. They are assaulting, they are making various attempts to storm, trying to change tactics. However, nonetheless, we see that Ukrainian forces are working quite seriously. Throughout the day, they even counterattack Nashi and achieve tactical successes. You know that recently at a meeting, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, General Alexander Syrsky, stated that Ukraine managed to reclaim 115 positions that were previously occupied by the enemy. This is quite a significant success, as General Syrsky emphasized. This is partly due to the quite serious and successful actions and the proper organization of active defense by our units. Therefore, the Pokrovsky direction is a priority for the enemy, but at the same time, it is one of the priorities for us in defense. A few weeks ago, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, was in this direction. Our command, including the Commander-in-Chief, General Syrskyi, often visits there, keeping the situation under control and preventing the realization of objectives. There is another direction that has become quite active, which is the Lyman area in the Donetsk region, and the enemy is concentrating its main efforts on the Pokrovsk and Lyman directions. So why is that? Well, because the Russian command is forced to narrow the areas of attack, as it is not feasible to advance simultaneously on all fronts, such as Sumy, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Kupiansk. Therefore, but as of today, they have determined that the priority for the near future in conducting military operations will be the attempt to capture the entire Donetsk region within its administrative territorial borders. These, in fact, are the plans and calculations of the Russian command, and this is what they will try to implement. And the second goal is what is called attempts, let's say attempts, to simply use firepower to exhaust the units of the armed forces of Ukraine in other directions, to conduct such harassing fire, to strike using drones and other methods, other types of weapons such as artillery and so on, in order to, try to exert influence, including psychologically, including by demonstrating and creating the impression that the offensive is proceeding equally along the entire front line. But that's not the case.
Alexander, well, I would like to continue by discussing with you how we should act in order to, enhance our security. In all options for security guarantees for Ukraine, a strong Ukrainian army is number one. This was stated by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. In his opinion, there are two different approaches to this issue. Let's hear the position and continue the conversation.
There are two directions, a contingent in a serious quantity or a smaller one, but with the involvement of NATO's Article 5. These are different formats. A very large foreign contingent is needed if there is no American backstop. This is absolutely difficult for everyone because it is an expensive path. But there is a model similar to Article 5, like in Israel, for example. There, the American backstop is effectively in place. In the event of aggression, America joins with other coalition partners, as it did when Iran attacked Israel. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, during a conversation with journalists.
Alexander, a short question, but it probably requires a broad answer from you. How do you perceive this concept? Yes, what we are currently discussing and applying with our partners. Yes, in conversations with the United States of America, with representatives of the coalition of the Resolute. Right? How do we achieve global security?
First of all, it is necessary to note that the President of Ukraine is absolutely right, Tamnadi, when he says that the number one priority and security guarantee for us is a strong army, the armed forces of Ukraine. This is obvious and it is an axiom, and we must understand that our army must be large, it must be well equipped, and we must constantly work on preparing the forces of national resistance and engaging with the population. And this will be a priority for the future. It is very important to note that there will be no concessions to Russia or fulfilling any of their demands, such as demilitarization and so on. This is not foreseen and will not happen. As for the EU coalition and our partners, indeed, the issue is quite serious. Discussions are currently underway. It is evident that partner countries have agreed that a military mission should be established in Ukraine. But in what form, in what quantity, and with what mandate? Serious consultations are still ongoing regarding this, but I can note quite significant progress. Right now, we see on the screen the meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and the British Prime Minister Starmer, which took place on April 26th in Rome. A rather successful visit by the President to both the Vatican and Rome. There are results, and the consultations continue precisely to ensure that the United States of America supports the idea, at least on a financial level, at least with intelligence support and arms supplies, particularly modern air defense systems, so that there is an opportunity to cover and protect the missions of military personnel from European countries that may appear in Ukraine. And in addition, of course, there are also security guarantees that may be provided. This includes the deployment of American contingents, which may appear alongside European ones. In addition, I do not rule out that in the future we will engage in dialogue and discussions about permanently stationing military personnel from foreign military contingents friendly to Ukraine, including the possible future establishment of foreign bases on Ukrainian territory. I think it's clear that this is currently prohibited by the main law, the Constitution, but if the question arises that we can reach this point and it becomes the basis of national security, I think it might be possible over time to consider the relevant changes. Therefore, as of today, positions are being established that the military mission should be present on Ukrainian territory. More and more countries are ready to discuss sending their military personnel, but there are still questions about the specific powers of the mission, its locations and its size, and these questions are currently being discussed. And a big plus to this is the fact that as of today, we do not hear that, for example, the United States is opposed. On the contrary, we hear that the United States and read in various media citing their sources are aware that the US will support this initiative and that foreign troops will indeed appear on Ukrainian territory. Why is this important? It is important because it is indeed another way and option to deter Russia, because contrary to Russian propaganda, bravado and statements as of today, there are no facts of Russia directly attacking NATO military personnel. Therefore, yes, they conduct hybrid operations. Yes, they conduct information operations. Yes, they cut cables on the seabed. Yes, they fly their drones and so on. They behave as provocatively and aggressively as possible. However, they do not attack NATO countries or their military personnel. Therefore, since there have been no such precedents, it is important for the military personnel of these countries to appear on Ukrainian territory as one of the elements of deterring Russia.
Alexander, thank you very much. You know, I would gladly continue the conversation with you. I think we would have enough questions and your answers for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. But I think there will be news. Hopefully pleasant for our security and our state, which we will gladly discuss with you. Thank you very much for joining our broadcast.
Thanks.
Alexander Musienko, a serviceman of the Territorial Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, military analyst, was with us live.